Hey there, welcome to the Early Retirement Roadmap Podcast, the show where I help you prepare for and thrive in early retirement. What if much of what you've heard about retirement is just plain wrong? In today's episode, I'm counting down the top 10 retirement myths that trip people up and busting each one with actual data from credible sources. And make sure you listen to this entire episode because busting these myths can really impact your retirement planning, potentially saving you thousands or shifting your thoughts on how much you really need to save in retirement, perhaps less than you thought. And myth number 1 at the end in particular just might change how you plan your retirement. I'll debunk myths about saving, Social Security, healthcare, and more so you can retire confidently. So be sure to listen about each myth and see it busted so you can plan better for retirement. And I won't just give opinions, I'll share the facts to set the record straight. And I'll provide the sources in the description or show notes so you can check them out for yourself if you wish. And there's one common belief that could cost you hundreds of thousands if you fall for it. And there's one common belief that could cost you hundreds of thousands if you fall for it that I'll expose in this episode too. So stay tuned. All right, let's start our countdown with myth number 10, which is you need $1 million to retire. A lot of people chase the idea of a magic number, often $1 million for retirement. But you know what? Most retirees have nowhere near that. According to an article published on retirementliving.com, a Federal Reserve study reported that fewer than 5% of retired households have $1 million saved, and under 2% have $2 million saved. In fact, the median savings for Americans aged 65 to 74 is about $200,000, meaning half have less than that. Yet many still retire comfortably by combining savings with Social Security or pensions. The fact is, the amount you need depends on your lifestyle, location, and income sources. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Planning how you'll live in retirement is more important than blindly chasing an arbitrary dollar goal, and there is no one magic number that works for everyone. It's highly individualized and depends upon factors like how and where you want to live in retirement. So you need to come up with a number that works for you. $1 million might be more than enough for some, but not enough for others. So don't be discouraged if you don't have a 7-figure nest egg. Focus on your own budget and income plan. Many retirees make it work without hitting that mythical 1 million mark. So can you. Of course, no matter what your number is, it's important to be a solid nest egg. But what about taxes on that nest egg? This leads us into myth number 9, which is you'll pay much less in taxes once you retire. Now that sounds logical. No paycheck, no big taxes, right? Unfortunately, retirement doesn't automatically put you in some ultra-low tax bracket. In reality, many retirees pay significant taxes, sometimes in surprising ways. For example, up to 85% of your Social Security benefits may be subject to federal income tax if your combined income, which includes your adjusted gross income, non-taxable interest, and half of your Social Security benefits exceeds $34,000 if you're single or $44,000 if you're married and filing jointly in 2025. For single filers with combined income between $25,000 and $34,000, or joint filers between $32,000 and $44,000, up to 50% of your benefits can be taxed. Benefits are not taxed if your combined income is below $25,000 for single filers or $32,000 for joint. So most middle-income retirees end up paying tax on at least a portion of their Social Security benefits. And remember, when you fund your retirement from your 401ks or IRAs, those withdrawals are taxed as ordinary income, just like when you were working. And if you're an early retiree withdrawing money from a taxable brokerage account, you're still going to pay long-term capital gains tax rates on assets you've held for more than a year. However, if you sell investments you've owned for 1 year or less, any gains are considered short-term and are taxed even worse at ordinary income. On top of all this, once you're in your 70s, Required minimum distributions, or RMDs, from your 401ks or IRAs can push you into a higher tax bracket and dramatically increase your tax bill. And don't forget those state taxes, property taxes, and sales taxes. Those don't magically disappear after you stop working. So you need to plan for taxes in retirement. Strategies like Roth conversions or tax-efficient withdrawals can help manage your tax bite. But it's a myth and a big mistake to think your taxes are going to be much less than when you were working. But what about other expenses being lower in retirement? Many assume their cost of living will plummet after they retire, and that leads us into our next myth, number 8, which is your living expenses will drop dramatically in retirement. Now, you may have heard the rule of thumb that you'll only need 70 to 80% of your current income in retirement, but the reality is that many retirees find they spend nearly as much as before or sometimes more. Why? Costs associated with commuting to work may go down, but other expenses pop up. There's travel, hobbies, and home projects that can fill in the gap. More importantly, healthcare costs tend to rise faster than inflation as we age, and healthcare costs can be a huge expense in retirement and are one of the top concerns for retirees in Schroeder's 2025 retirement study. And per a study done by Fidelity and reported in March, 57% of retirees say healthcare costs are higher than they had anticipated, nor had they planned for it. And if you retire early and need to get your own health insurance, that's a huge cost you have to plan for. Plus, if you live a long time, and depending upon the age you retire, especially if you retire early, you could face decades of expenses with inflation gradually eroding purchasing power. The bottom line is, don't assume a dramatic spending drop in retirement. It's safer to budget for similar expenses as you have now while working and build a cushion for later years. As an early retiree myself, having retired last year at the age of 55, I can honestly say that our expenses have not decreased in retirement. The lifestyle you had pre-retirement doesn't suddenly change just because you've retired. In fact, many retirees, including myself, actually see a spending spike in the early years of retirement, often called the go-go years, when they are still young and healthy enough to travel and be really active. So they spend more in those years, which is then followed by a lull and then possibly another uptick if healthcare or long-term care costs arise. You may have seen or heard this called the retirement smile pattern for retirement spending. David Blanchett came up with it back in 2014. So speaking of expenses, many plan to retire on Social Security for the bulk of their income and to fund their expenses, which brings us to myth number 7, which can be a really dangerous one. It's the myth that Social Security will fully cover your retirement needs. After paying into Social Security your entire working life, it's easy to think those monthly checks are going to have you set. But huge reality check, Social Security was never meant to be a retiree's sole support. For the average retiree at 65, Social Security replaces only about 37% of their previous earnings per the National Council on Aging. Put another way, you're getting roughly 1/3 of your old income, so you must fund the other 2/3 yourself. And per Kiplinger, in 2025, the average Social Security benefit for all retired workers is $1,976 per month and $3,089 for married couples that are both receiving benefits. And per the National Council on Aging, more than 1 in 3 retirees tell researchers they ended up having less from Social Security than they expected while working. And remember, Social Security is subject to annual cost of living adjustments, or COLAs, but they may not fully keep up with true inflation in your expenses, especially healthcare. The takeaway here is to think of Social Security as a base income floor, but not your whole retirement plan. It's a critical supplement, and indeed for lower income seniors, it's the majority of their income. But if you want to maintain your lifestyle, you'll need personal savings or other income streams on top. Treat any estimate of your Social Security benefit as just one part of your retirement paycheck. And if you're worried Social Security won't be there at all in the future, you're not alone, and that's actually our next myth, and the truth might surprise you. This myth is Social Security will disappear by the time I retire. Now, you've probably heard the doom and gloom headlines, Social Security is going bankrupt. This myth causes a lot of anxiety, so let's bust it with the data. It's true that Social Security's trust fund has challenges. Per Kiplinger, starting around 2033, the program is projected to only have enough income tax revenue to pay about 77% of scheduled benefits. That means if nothing is done, benefits could be cut by 23%. However, Social Security is not going to vanish or run out to zero. Even in the worst case scenarios, retirees would continue to receive the majority of their benefits per Kiplinger. In fact, Social Security is largely pay-as-you-go, meaning current workers' payroll taxes fund current retirees' benefits. So as long as people are working, money will be flowing in. Now, Congress could act before 2033 to shore up the system as it did in the 1980s, but even if they play chicken with the deadline, benefits aren't just going to stop. So worst case, checks might be smaller if a fix isn't found, which is certainly an issue to plan for, but plan for a haircut, not a total loss. So don't write off Social Security in your financial plan. It's almost certainly going to be there in some form. Just stay informed of any reforms and maybe build in a contingency. For example, assuming you might get 75 to 80% of your full benefit in the distant future, if you want to be extra conservative in your planning. Next up is myth number 5, which deals with another crucial pillar of retirement security, your health. Many folks assume one government program has them covered here, but that assumption can be very costly. In fact, remember when I said at the beginning that one myth could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars if you fall for it? Well, it's this one. Myth number 5 is Medicare will cover all of my healthcare costs in retirement. Now, it would be nice if at the magical age of 65, you get on Medicare and never have to worry about medical bills again, if only that were true. The reality is that Medicare Parts A and B cover a lot of hospital and doctor services, but it doesn't cover everything, and it's certainly not free. You'll still have premiums, deductibles, and copays, plus crucial services like long-term care, dental, vision, and hearing aids are not covered by Parts A and B. Those costs land on you unless you have supplemental insurance. So how much could that be? According to Fidelity Investments, in 2023, the average 65-year-old single retiree can expect about $157,500 for out-of-pocket healthcare costs and $350,000 for a couple. And you heard that right, over $250,000 just for medical expenses beyond what Medicare pays. And that figure excludes long-term care. No wonder 59% of older adults say they're not confident they can afford healthcare in retirement per the National Council on Aging. Also, Medicare Part B for outpatient medical care and supplies, and Part D for prescription drug coverage, both require monthly premiums. If your income exceeds certain thresholds, you may also be subject to additional surcharges known as the Income-Related Monthly Adjustment Amount, or IRMA, say that 5 times fast, which can raise your premiums. You could end up incurring these charges, especially as a result of required minimum distribution 401ks and IRAs once you're in your 70s. So plan for healthcare costs. Consider a supplemental Medigap or Medicare Advantage plan, budget for premiums and out-of-pocket expenses, and look into long-term care insurance or set aside funds for that possibility. Medicare is a big help, but it's not a free pass on all health expenses. So at this point, we've busted myths about money and benefits. Now let's talk about you and your plans. Many people think they can always fall back on working longer if money runs short. And myth number 4 is a cautionary tale about that. It's I can always work longer if I need more money. Many people just think I'll just keep working until 70 if I must, problem solved. Now that's a reassuring thought, especially if you're behind on savings. But that myth collides with a harsh reality. You might not have full control over when you retire. Surveys show a large share of retirees leave the workforce earlier than they had planned, often not by choice. In one recent retirement survey reported by the National Council on Aging, 64% of retirees said they stopped working earlier than expected. That's nearly 2/3. The reasons: health problems can crop up, layoffs or downsizing happen, or you might need to care for a spouse or another family member. The takeaway is that it's perfectly fine to work longer, and many people do enjoy working into their late 60s if they can, but don't bank your whole financial plan on it. Prepare as if you might have to retire earlier. It's prudent to hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. If you end up working longer and earning more, great, you'll be extra secure. But if not, you won't be caught off guard. But even if you retire on your terms, what about lifestyle changes? Many assume that stereotypical retirement of downsizing the house and hitting the road in an RV. But is that really the norm? That leads us to myth number 3, which is everybody downsizes and simplifies their home in retirement. Sell the big family house, move to a tiny condo in Florida. Isn't that what retirees do? Well, no, not as much as you'd think. The data shows most retirees don't immediately downsize their home, and those who do often take years to make that move. In fact, in a study done by Merrill Lynch and AgeWave with more than 3,600 respondents, 49% of retirees didn't downsize in their last move, and 30% actually ended up moving into larger homes. That really shocked me. There are emotional ties to the home and community that keep many folks where they are. Plus, keep in mind, moving is expensive and stressful. I actually hate moving. And here's the twist. Downsizing doesn't always save as much as people expect. Sure, you might cash out some home equity, but buying a smaller place can be surprisingly costly in today's market. Many retirees who downsize end up spending on renovations or upgrades in their new home, or they may move to a desirable area where smaller doesn't equal cheaper. The net savings can end up being modest or nil. The point is, don't assume you're required to downsize in retirement if that's not what you want. It's a personal choice. If you love your home and can afford to stay, you might be happier just staying in place. On the other hand, if the house is too big or too expensive, downsizing might free up funds and reduce maintenance. Just make that decision based on your situation. The typical retirement lifestyle is more diverse than the cliches that you've heard. And speaking of cliches, what about that idea that a long retirement might be dull or lead to regret? Our final 2 myths tackle the emotional side of retirement, starting with longevity and then happiness. Myth number 2 is, I'm not going to live that long, so I don't need to save for 20-year retirement. That myth is so dangerous. Some folks think, hey, my parents only lived to 75, I probably won't reach to 90, but our life expectancies are increasing, so you can't assume you're only going to live as long as your parents did, and you might live longer than you expect, especially if you're healthy at age 65. As reported by the National Council on Aging, according to the Social Security Administration, 1 out of 3 65-year-olds will live to age 90, and 1 in 7 will make it to 95 or older. That means your retirement could easily last 25 to 30 years, and if you retire early, you'll need to plan for an even longer retirement. Outliving your savings is a real risk. In fact, longevity risk, the risk of running out of money because you live longer than expected, is something financial planners plan for now. Many retirees underestimate how long their money needs to last. Americans are living longer thanks to medical advances and healthier lifestyles, which is great, but it means we have to finance more years of life after work. So plan for a long life, and that way too, you'll be prepared even if it's shorter, rather than the other way around. This likely will mean being more conservative in withdrawal rates from your investments and having a larger nest egg to fund that long retirement. Don't assume you can spend aggressively or ignore inflation just because you think you're not going to reach 85 or 90. You very well might, and you'll want your money to last if you do. Now, drumroll please, we've arrived at the number 1 myth, and it's a biggie. It's about something many pre-retirees secretly worry about. Myth number 1 is retirement will be boring and I'll regret retiring early. Let's end on a positive note by busting a myth that holds a lot of people back. The fear that if you retire, and especially if you retire early, you're going to be bored, unhappy, or full of regret without work. We often derive purpose and identity from our career, so it's natural to worry about this. But studies show that most retirees are actually happier and wish they had retired sooner. In fact, last year, a MassMutual study found that 67% of retirees say they are happier than when they were working, and only 8% say they are less happy. And 82% feel more relaxed on a typical day compared to before they were retired. And 75% say they are less stressed than they were before retirement. And what about boredom? Turns out the fear of endless boredom is largely overblown. In fact, in the same MassMutual study, 28% of pre-retirees expected to be bored, but in reality, only 15% said they actually got bored. The fact is, most retirees keep busy with hobbies, they travel, spend time with family, or just relish the relaxation. In fact, most retirees report high levels of life satisfaction, especially a couple of years into retirement once they settle into it. And many discover that retirement offers the chance to explore new interests, volunteer, socialize, or even start small side projects on their own terms, things they didn't have time for while working. Sure, the transition can be challenging at first, but you need to have a plan for your time and a sense of purpose. And if you have boredom, it's typically occasional, not a daily torment. And I think it's a real choice too. It's not some condition that's forced upon you. You make a choice to be bored. And I can honestly say that as an early retiree, there has not been one single day that I've been bored. It's because I'm not only creating content for my YouTube channel and podcasts, but I have a lot of other things I'm doing too. Besides this, I play the piano, garden, and I'm trying to focus more on my health. I'm also traveling and taking care of a lot of those to-do list items around the house that I simply wasn't able to get to while I was working. So don't let fear-mongering about retirement misery keep you chained to your desk if you're otherwise ready to retire. Most retirees thrive, and you can too, especially if you retire to something, not just from something. You need to have goals, interests, or social connections lined up. And remember, retirement isn't the end, it's the start of a new chapter, and speaking from experience, a pretty great one at that. And for many, it truly is the golden years in terms of happiness and freedom. Well, that wraps up busting 10 huge myths about retirement. Thank you so much for joining me today. And if you're ever not on the go, catch my Early Retirement Roadmap YouTube channel and go to MikeUpland.com for all of my media, including my blog. Until next time, this is Mike Upland, early retiree last year at age 55, wishing you to take care and make the most of today.